Okay, perfect. All right. Well, I think it's always important when you're speaking to get to know your speaker a little bit. And everybody loves talking about themselves, right? So um, Jill gave me a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate that, Jill. So I'll skip most of this stuff and just get down to the last part, families. So this is supposed to be me and my wife, and I couldn't find a husky. We do have a husky, but I found a German Shepherd. And so my wife is also a professor at Fresno State. We actually met during orientation, and um, she is a professor of civil engineering. So we both just got tenure this year, which we're pretty excited about. And this is our little guy, Keanu. He turned 1 year old, and he had his shots today. So he's not overly happy with us today, but he's normally a pretty happy young guy. And he's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, and I'll talk to you about some more as we move through this. So, in terms of kind of how I got into this research, um, when I first started my career, I was unlucky and lucky in that my first real job out of college was one of the worst jobs I've ever had. I was a corporate recruiting specialist for Cerberus private equity firm-owned company, and this was right around the Great Recession. So my job was to recruit and hire people, and essentially the goal of this organization was to find undervalued companies, restructure, fire anyone who didn't fit the mission, um, and sell it off in about 5 years. So on a good day, you didn't know if you were going to have a job the next day, the next week. And this was not an ideal situation because it was pretty cutthroat. And aside from just the lack of job security, um, I think most people felt that they were disposable. So it wasn't. I didn't feel great about hiring in this position. And I remember, I was always really anxious on Sunday nights when I'd get to the work week. And one night in particular, it was like 2 a.m. and I'm up, can't fall asleep. I'm just thinking about all of my worries, like we sometimes do. Um, and I get up and I go through the usual routine. I'm rushing out the door to get ready. I've got this piece of garbage car that I'm just hoping doesn't break down on the way. And I finally get there, and I'm pretty stressed at this point, just like I was every day. And I get into the elevator, and I see this guy who is the director of our quality team. And the people who I worked with, like this guy Dan, they were toward the end of their careers. This was our corporate office. They were all successful by objective measures. They had made it, right? And I remember as I'm getting into the elevator, I look over at Dan, and he looks at me, and he's just got this sunken look in his face. And I could, it just seemed like he had just been beaten down. That life had been harder than it should have been. And I remember he looked at me, and I wasn't particularly close with him, which is why I was really surprised at what he said. He said, "John, if I could do this all over again, I'd be flipping burgers in my restaurant." He said, "Don't waste don't do what I did. Don't waste your life." And this is, 8 a.m. I'm already stressed out. I'm worried about getting late, being late for work. The last thing I thought of was to have this sort of life-changing moment in an elevator. And I thought to myself, what the hell am I doing here? I hate my job. I don't believe in what the company is doing. And that really got me thinking about happiness. And, are people happy with what they're doing? We know that over 70% of Americans hate their jobs or they're mentally checked out. About 72% of Americans aren't engaged or enthusiastic in the work that they do. And a similar percentage don't feel appreciated in what they do. So, that means when you're on your way to work or wherever you're going, and you see people on their way to work in the morning, there's a good chance that 7 out of those 10 cars, there's somebody miserable inside. And given how long we spend at work, I just thought this isn't a way to live your life, just kind of barely scraping by. And so I wanted to study happiness, but at this point, I had an undergrad in business, I had my MBA, and it's the real route for me to do this was through a PhD program. And so I went into a business school, but I realized I couldn't just study happiness. I had to sort of make it seem like it was something else. And so I would look at things like mergers and acquisitions, large-scale organizational change, and I'd see why people responded differently to the same event. You know, why do some people thrive in situations and other people suffer in the same situations? And in this way, I found that the way in which you view the world is much more important to your happiness, your well-being, than what happens to you in the situation that you find yourself in. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today, and that's what I'm hoping you'll get out of this is the lens. You know, you're looking at the world through your own eyes, and it's different from how everyone else views it. And if we can change that lens, that's going to be, it's not going to be the hardwood floor. It's not going to be the new car. It's not going to be the bigger backyard. It's going to be shifting the way that we view the world. That's what's going to make us lastingly happier. So I had to prove to my advisor and others that happiness was worth studying. It was a worthwhile pursuit, even in business. And I remember when I first brought it up, my advisor had said, you know, nobody cares about happiness. It doesn't, you don't need to be happy your employees don't need to be happy for them to perform well. And I kind of thought, I don't know about that. And so I started looking at the research. And we know that happy people, they have higher odds of marriage, they have lower odds of divorce, they have more friends, make more money, stronger social support, more self-control. They have a higher ability to cope, they have a bolstered immune system, they even live longer. So you could argue from a professional standpoint that happiness is something that is really, really important. And I'm going to try to move a little bit closer to the mic here. So sorry, my face is going to be plastered right in front of you. So from a personal standpoint, happiness is important, right? But from a professional standpoint, we know that people who are happy, they're more productive, they're more creative, they're more satisfied with their work, they have a higher quality of work, they're more likely to help others at work, they're more engaged, and they have greater health and energy. And we know this isn't just a correlation. It's not just that happy people tend to have all, you know, that if you're more creative, if you're better performing, you're happier. We know that this is a two-way street, that the happier you are, the more successful you'll become. And in turn, this creates a virtuous cycle where the more successful you are, the happier you become. So happiness is certainly a worthwhile pursuit. It's worth looking at. So what I want you to do now is think about what do you think causes happiness? Are happy people, are they better looking? Do they make more money? Do they have fewer bad events and more good events in their lives? Do they all live in California? So I want you to write in the chat box what your thoughts are on what causes happiness. And I'm going to give you a few seconds to do that. So what causes you happiness? Just write it in the chat box. Okay, so I'm seeing gratitude, sunshine, living with your values, attitude, grandchildren, retirement and playing with my grandkids. Sounds like a nice one. Self-worth, positive attitude, good health. Okay. Being content with yourself, feeling secure, succeeding at a task. Yeah, these are all wonderful things that being spiritually connected, better balanced neurotransmitters. Yeah. So when we think about this group, I think is a little bit different than most of the groups that I talk to, and certainly in your responses. And most people, when you ask them what would make you happier, they talk about something to do with life circumstances. So the good news is that you already know a lot more about how to become happier just in the responses that I've seen. The other good news is that happiness tends to increase once we hit 50, and it increases steadily for the next 3 decades. And this isn't because of some ambiguous reason. It's that as people get older, they get better at accepting what they can't change and focusing more on those things that make them happier. So that's sort of the good news here. When we look at feeling like you belong, yeah, that's a really, really important one, as we'll get to. Relationships, not feeling lonely, this is huge. So when we look at this happiness pie, this is sort of the breakdown of what determines happiness. So studies of twins have shown us that about 50% of your happiness is heritable. It's due to genetics. About 10% is due to life circumstances, and 40% is due to intentional activities that we engage in on a daily basis. So these are cognitions and behaviors, things that we do to essentially make ourselves happier. As you may have seen the TED Talk by Sean Acher, it's a really good one if you haven't. He said 90% of happiness is not predicted by your external world, but by the way your brain processes the world. And so by 90%, he's referring to the 50% genetics, 40% intentional activities, those cognitions and behaviors that we engage in. And I would argue that most people think that this 10% is much more important than it is. So let's kind of walk through each one of these and see what we can do. Because the reality is that life circumstances, where you live, your job status, the type of car you drive, your house, how much money you have, these things account for a very small proportion of your happiness. That's not to say that we shouldn't try to improve them, right? 10% is still 10%. If we can move closer to work, if we can, stop doing those things, stop engaging in those habits that we do every day that make us unhappy, that's going to be huge. But life circumstances in general, you're not going to be any happier by moving to a different state. If you're outside of California right now, aside from the fires, it's not necessarily going to help you to move here. In fact, people are happier in Minnesota than they are in California. So let's walk through each one of these. The first one I want to talk about is genetics. So this is a big one. 50% of your happiness is due to your genetics, what you've inherited. And there's some implications here. One is that your genetics are going to influence the kind of experiences and environments that you have or that you seek to have. And although we can steer individuals away from situations and behaviors that attract from well-being based on their genetics, so let's say we know someone has a predisposition to addiction, then we can engage in early interventions and try to take them away from situations that would help foster that addiction. But our control here is fairly limited. Perhaps in the future, there's more that we can do in this area, but right now, this is not the low-hanging fruit. This is, if I were you, this is probably not what I would focus too much on. The next aspect, life circumstances, the 10%. If we go into here, we see things like location, age, gender, ethnicity, personal history, marital status, occupation, job security, even income. These things make up a relatively small proportion of your overall happiness. And you might be thinking at this point, okay, I don't believe it, that, income, money, I know a lot of people who would be happier if they had more money. And you might be right. So I'm here to tell you that the relationship between money and happiness is not as straightforward as it might seem. So what I want to do is I want to tell you two stories that kind of get to what illuminate what I'm trying to talk about. And that is, the first was done by Ed Diener. He was actually a former student at Fresno State. He's now a professor at the University of Chicago, and he's one of the leading researchers in happiness. So what Ed did was he looked at the wealthiest people in the world, and he found that they were only marginally happier than those who were middle class. And this was a pretty interesting finding, right? Because, when you're thinking about who's happy, I think we'd all love a Ferrari and a huge house and to live on the beach. And so when he found this out, he was really interested in why this was the case. And in fact, one person who's making $25,000 a year wrote, "Money and happiness bear little, if any, relation to each other. In fact, the reasons why people gave for being happy was that more often they listed family and friends, good health, achievable goals, religious beliefs. So money didn't really come into play too much yet. But there's one really important caveat here, right? We're talking about people who are middle class. These aren't people who are suffering to meet their basic needs. So let me tell you one more story. And you may have heard of this one. This is a pretty popular study with lottery winners and accident victims. And so what researchers did was they looked at 22 major lottery winners and 29 people who had been paralyzed in an accident. This was done in Northwestern University in the 1970s, and they wanted to see how their happiness was impacted by these different life situations, these different life events. And what they found was that people who won the lottery and people who were in accidents were surprisingly not very different in how happy they were. In fact, people who won the lottery, although their life evaluation was slightly higher, their enjoyment, their day-to-day enjoyment was actually lower than the people who became paralyzed. And their expectation for a better future, for a happier future, was also lower. So what's going on here? Well, initially, we know that if we win the lottery, we're going to be much happier right away than if we were in a terrible accident. That's, I think, pretty intuitive. But what occurs is what you see here. So once we win the lottery, we get an immediate boost in happiness. But this is really ephemeral. It's really short lasting. If we got in an accident, God forbid, we'd be really hurt by that, really upset. You've got to readjust. But humans have an incredible ability to adapt to both positive and negative events. And what we found is that with few exceptions, after about 3 months, you generally return to your baseline, your former baseline of happiness. So we stay generally at about the same level of happiness throughout situations, positive or negative. So a good thing happens, we get a boost in happiness, bad thing happens, our happiness goes down, but within a few months, we generally return to that same level of happiness. And so, each day, about 90 million people play the lottery. On a good day, your odds of winning are about 1 in 300 million. Put this into perspective, you have greater chances of dying, falling out of bed, getting hit by a coconut, being attacked by a shark, being struck by lightning. I mean, these aren't odds that you necessarily want. So how is it that all of these people are wrong? Well, this gets to this idea of this hedonic treadmill that so as our situation changes, our expectations and our desires change in tandem. So when you ask people, for example, how much money do you need to get along? Generally, the amount of money that people make and the amount that they say increases together. So there's almost a direct relationship here. Whereas if I'm making more money, now I say I need more to be happy with the amount of money I make. So what is occurring is this idea of this hedonic treadmill. As our situation changes, we quickly adapt to it, and we expect different things. So if we make more money, now we need more to be happy. If we make less money, now we need less to be happy. We just have this amazing ability to adapt. So this isn't what most people think, right? A lot of people, they think, okay, if I get more money, more stuff, then I'm gonna be much happier. But in reality, what we've seen from this hedonic treadmill, what we've seen from this research is that, yeah, you're gonna have a temporary boost if you get that promotion, but you're generally going to return to that same baseline of happiness. And if anything, now you might need more and more to satiate your desires. So you're wanting this need grows as your situation improves. And a lot of people might think this is just a cartoon, right? So let's look at the data. We've seen the average income per capita has pretty drastically increased over the last few decades. However, the percentage of very happy people has generally remained the same, and actually happiness, as we'll see, has decreased over the last 2 decades in the US. So, we're as safe as we've ever been. People are making more money than they've ever made for the most part, but happiness isn't getting better. So there's a disconnect here between what we're pursuing to become happier and what will actually make us happier. Now, I mentioned it's not that straightforward, right? It would be pretty silly of me to say money doesn't matter, because it does. Money can make us happier. But how much is enough? How much do we need to be happier? So there is a doctoral student at Purdue University who I talked to recently. He actually conducted a study of over 1.5 million people using data from Gallup. And this was representative of, the sample was representative of 98% of the world's population. And what he found was that your happiness, as Ed Diener said, the first dollar matters a lot, later dollars not so much. So we can see this is income here, and these are different measures of happiness from life evaluation, positive affect. Happiness increases dramatically. So if we are struggling to pay the bills, if we're struggling, if we're worried about where we're going to get money for food, money matters. But after a certain point, more happiness doesn't cause more money doesn't cause more happiness. And in fact, we can see that there's actually an inflection point here where over about $105,000, we see people's happiness tends to decrease. We're not entirely sure why that is. I think part of it may be that our values tend to change. If we're pursuing money to a high degree, it could be that we start valuing the wrong things. And there are a couple other things going on here. If you're making more money, chances are you have a more stressful job. You're working longer hours. You're spending less time with family and friends. So where's the sweet spot? How much do you need? Well, about $50,000 for a single person household in the U.S., adjusting for cost of living. Fresno is pretty close to the national average. So that's kind of where we're at here. Is that after about $50,000, you'll see the slope it increases slightly up to $105,000. So that $105,000 is the mathematical, that's the maximum for optimal happiness. But the difference between 50,000 and 105 is pretty insignificant. So that's a pretty interesting finding, is that, yeah, of course money matters. As Nobel laureate Danny Kahneman said, money doesn't buy you happiness, but a lack of money certainly buys you misery. So when people are struggling to eat, when they're struggling to pay for food and clothing, then money matters. Once you have that knocked out, once that's not a problem, then you want to focus on the other stuff. So you can think of money as like sleep. If we don't get enough sleep, and I can tell you, having a 1-year-old who at this point still doesn't sleep through the night, sleep's important. If we don't have enough sleep, we're going to be pretty miserable from time to time. But once we've slept enough, more sleep isn't going to make us any happier, right? And money is just the same way. Now, there are a few other things that you can do. If, let's say, you're sitting there and you're thinking, gosh, I've got so much money, and now I don't know what I got it all for, right? Well, don't worry. If that's your problem, there are a couple ways that you can still become happier with the money that you have. So one is spend it on others. So when we spend money on others, we get a release of dopamine and oxytocin, these sort of feel-good hormones and chemicals that they make us feel much better about ourselves. And what's interesting is there was a recent study at the University of British Columbia, and what they did was they gave students $5 or $20, and they had them spend it on either themselves or others. And then they had them come back later that day, and they remeasured how happy they were. And they found that students who spent money on themselves weren't any happier. Students who spent money on other people were significantly happier. It didn't matter how much they spent. It didn't matter if it was the $5 or the $20. Simply the act of doing something kind for other people made them feel much happier. And these random acts of kindness, they have the ability to not only just make you happy for today, but we've seen the effect last as long as 6 months. So this is something that, I encourage you, if you're not already doing, think about once a month, what can I do to help other people? And it doesn't have to be money, right? You can help other people by a compliment that you give them, by opening the door for them, things like that. So spending on other people, we know that in terms of experiences, we habituate much quicker to things than experiences. So you're much better off going on, not a vacation right now probably, but maybe you can take a road trip and camp somewhere. But generally, you're much better off going on a vacation than you are buying a bigger TV or installing that new hardwood floor. Those experiences give us something to reflect on, to remember, and they generally bring that lasting enjoyment that we don't habituate to like we do material things. And then practicing savoring and gratitude. You know, material things, I'm not here to tell you, I'm in a business school, right? I'd be crazy to tell you that you shouldn't be buying material things. I wouldn't have a job. There is some benefit to, you know, maybe you love cars, maybe you love art, whatever it is. That doesn't mean that all this stuff that we buy can't bring more happiness. It's just the realization that, hey, I'm going to habituate to this really quickly. So what we can do is we can practice savoring. We can realize and practice gratitude. We can realize, you know, I'm so fortunate to have this thing. When I get in my car in the morning, I think, gosh, it's really nice to have this car instead of the one that was falling apart. You know, so, and when we're using that thing, we can, you know, just every act of it, this laptop I have in front of me, this is amazing, right? I'm able to talk to all of you, appreciating that while I'm using it, really can help us to slow that habituation process, slow the process by which it doesn't make us any happier. And so that's what you really want to do. If you've got stuff that you love, remind yourself how fortunate you are to be here right now, to be healthy enough and to have enough money to have an internet connection and all this stuff. So material things can bring you some happiness, but there's a good chance you'll habituate to most of the things that you have. So one of the best ways to figure out how to become happier is by looking at who the happiest people are in the world. And so Martin Seligman, the founder of positive psychology, and Ed Diener, in 1999, they did just that. And they actually replicated this study in 2018. And they said, okay, let's look at what the happiest people in the world have in common. And so there are a couple of things. I know I've got a whole lot on this slide, but I'll just kind of read off to you some of the important ones. So there are a couple of things that are really important. One is, a lot of you mentioned attitude. They tend to see the positives. They tend to have a fairly optimistic outlook and a positive temperament. They don't ruminate excessively. They don't keep thinking about their worries. They worry just like anybody else, but they catch themselves doing it and they go back to being present. They make progress toward valued goals. They more often felt proud of something. They learn something new each day. They spend more time with family and friends. They have more control and freedom over the time that they spend, which is one of the huge benefits, of course, of retirement. They're in better physical shape. They dedicate more time to exercise and sleep. They have enough money to meet basic needs generally. They live in an economically developed society, and they have good relationships. So this aspect of good relationships is, it's hard to understate how important good relationships are. In fact, when we look at the happiest people, we know that that almost all of them, Dr. Seligman says, nobody enters the happiest group without good relationships. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition of being very happy. In fact, when we look at the mortality rates of people who have poor, insufficient relationships versus those who have good ones, they have a significantly higher mortality rate, to the point that it would be like them smoking 15 cigarettes per day. That's how much good relationships matter. So this is really huge. And as you'll see here, if you look through some of these percentages, just for happiest versus unhappiest people, one of the big ones that stands out is stress. The very happiest people, they experience less stress, 11% versus 87%. However, we know that the happiest people, it's not that they experience fewer bad events and more good events. It's that when they do encounter a stressful situation, they look at it as a challenge rather than a threat. And so what do I mean by that? When we look at something as a challenge rather than a threat, we think that our resources exceed the demands that are being placed on us. And there's one study, for those of you who have seen Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn's work on telomeres, she's actually won a Nobel Prize for this. She found this sort of the secret to aging is that these protective ends on our chromosomes, they break down over time, primarily due to chronic stress. And in one study, she looked at mothers who had children with pretty severe disabilities. this is, of course, it was a hard situation for these mothers to raise these kids. And they found that the mothers who were in these situations had much shorter telomeres. The ends of their chromosomes were more likely to be broken down than those who raised children without disabilities, without these severe disabilities. So this was a pretty startling finding, and that intuitively now we probably know it makes sense, but chronic stress reduces your lifespan. It makes you more prone to injury, disease, illness. And what she found, though, that was really interesting is not all the mothers had this. Some mothers were in the same situation and their telomeres were still quite long. They're still in good shape. So what she found was the difference between these two was that the mothers who had healthy telomeres, they looked at their situation as a challenge. They knew that they had the resources to deal with whatever it is was going to come their way, and that they were going to succeed. The mothers who suffered the most, they felt overwhelmed by their situation. They felt that they couldn't cope, and that the demands that were being placed on them outweighed their resources. So the way in which you view the world, if you can view the world as a challenge rather than a threat, that's going to have a huge impact on your health. So where do the happiest people live? Well, let's take a look. And unfortunately, they don't live mostly in the US. They're mainly in Finland, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and the Netherlands. As you'll see, the US is number 19 on the ranking of happiness countries. So it's not horrible, but not great. It's been getting worse over the last 2 decades. So these countries are marked by social support, life expectancy, freedom, equality, low corruption. They have trust. People have trust in one another and trust in their government. There's usually free healthcare, free education, and other quality resources offered by the government. So in terms of, at an institutional level, it seems that countries have the ability to inhibit or promote well-being based on these things that they're doing. Now let's take a look and shift to the US for a moment. And I know you came here looking for happiness talk, and I got to warn you, this part's not going to be the happiest part of it. So the US again is number 19. We've been significantly dropping for the last 2 decades, particularly the years since 2010 have been pretty bad ones for the US. So as an example, let's look at college students. There was a study conducted by Dr. Jean Twang when she was at San Diego State, and she looked at 787,000 undergraduate students across the US, and she found that 41.1% were suffering from moderate to severe depression in 2018 versus 23% in 2007. This is a pretty dramatic change over just about a decade. And now let's look more broadly. If we look at just the average American, how are we doing? 1 in 5 are currently suffering from a mental illness. And in terms of anxiety, depression, 40 million adults in the US are currently suffering from some sort of anxiety disorder. So the current state of happiness of Americans is not great. Now, if we take a more macro perspective, things seem to be going pretty well. Despite being in a pandemic, we can see here GDP is about as high as it's ever been. In the stock market, although it took a pretty big plunge back in March, it's pretty close to where it was before. This is the S&P 500 as of yesterday. So, how can things be going so well, seemingly so well, considering we're in a pandemic at a national level, but Americans seem to be suffering so much? Well, Robert Kennedy said something that I thought was really good. In 1968, he was speaking at the University of Kansas, and he said, gross national product, it tells us just about everything. Yet the gross national product does not allow the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except which makes life worthwhile. And I think that one of the reasons why you see so many people who, at that 105,000 mark, when we go to money, when you see people falling off and you see lottery winners, they quickly return to their baseline of happiness. I think one of the reasons is when money is a problem, we can always say, I'm going to be happier when. I'm going to be happier when I get this or when I get that. The problem is when people achieve those things and they say, now I'm supposed to be happy and I'm not. You know, that's a tough thing to deal with. And so that can oftentimes bring people pretty suddenly crashing back down to that original baseline of happiness, if not lower. And that's sort of at a national level. Yeah, as a country, at least economically, we seem to be doing okay, but our people are not. So what's going on here? Well, we can look to a couple different answers. So we know loneliness is a huge factor. More people than ever today report feeling alone. And actually, this research is from just before the pandemic. So imagine before all of this isolation, more people than ever felt alone. 50% report feeling alone, isolated, left out, or lonely. 1 in 5 rarely feel close to anyone. Most of us don't know our neighbors. Maybe think about it. Maybe you do, but I think, if you're anything like me, I hardly ever, aside from 1 or 2, we don't get together, we don't socialize, we don't really know each other. Neighborhoods in the US have changed quite a bit. And more than half of Americans don't know their neighbors. So social support is a huge factor here. And of course, related to that, potentially due in part because of that, we're in an epidemic of addictions. So you see here, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, who's the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. What he said is, my argument is that the US is suffering an epidemic of addictions, and that these addictions are leaving a rising portion of American society unhappy and a rising number clinically depressed. Technology is a big one. We see young people ages 15 to 24 are on their phones every 8.6 minutes. People, particularly young women who spend 5 or more hours on social media, are 3 to 5 times more likely to be clinically depressed than people who don't. We see a huge uptick in alcohol, drugs, food addiction, shopping addiction, and work. Surprisingly, this isn't an addiction that's talked about too often, but a lot of people are working in part to cover this shopping addiction. But also people are working because they feel that they sort of have to, that, if I don't do this, I'm going to be looked down on. If I take a day off, I'm going to be judged. And so this is really interesting. Let's look at some numbers in terms of work. So a study published by a doctoral student at MIT found that Americans need to work, this is for professional jobs, need to work 11 hours per week to be as productive as somebody working 40 hours in 1950. Yet Americans are working more than ever before. Americans work 173 more hours per year than they did in 1980, and 40% are now working 50 or more hours per week. Americans receive 20 fewer vacation days and work 258 hours more than the average European. In total, Americans gave up about 212 million days off in 2017, resulting in about 62 billion in lost benefits. And the reasons, again, why people say that they're working so much is fear that they'll get fired, fear that they'll fall behind in their work or be judged if they're not, the first one to walk in the door and the last one to leave. And this is leading a lot of people to be chronically stressed. So, is this all worth it? Are Americans, do we have money falling from the sky? Is this leading to wealth and prosperity? Well, the answer to that is overwhelmingly no. More than 50%, or actually almost 50% of Americans last year made about $30,000 a year. 70% of Americans report having less than $1,000 saved. We're pursuing, a lot of us, we're pursuing money at the cost of our health to purchase goods that we're going to habituate to in short order, and that will trigger our brains to want more and more. So I think one of the problems I see is that people are pursuing the wrong stuff. They think, if I get that promotion, if I get that car, if I get that house, if I get that backyard, then I'll be happy. But that, as we've overwhelmingly seen, is not the case. If anything, you'll get a brief boost in happiness, but that is likely to be about it. So let's talk about kind of where we're at now. And so I mentioned to you that I recently wrote a book called The Happiest People. And a big part of this came from the research that I've talked to you and from positive psychology, neuroscience, and business. Positive psychology was really what kicked off this idea of happiness research, particularly in business schools. And what's interesting actually is Martin Seligman. I mentioned he's sort of the founder, the father of positive psychology. He's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And a few decades ago, he got together with his friends and he rented a house in the Yucatan, formerly owned by the Grateful Dead. And he talked his friends into coming down and spending their New Year's down there with him. And then they got together and he decided that the state of psychology is not good enough, that for the longest time, psychology students were told the best you can take is take miserable people and make them less miserable. What he was interested in is not bringing people to just a state of neutral, which is really the goal of many psychology interventions. If we're at a neutral state versus being miserable, yeah, that's better. But that's not happiness, right? Happiness is on a spectrum, just like love is on a spectrum with hate. If we reduce all the hate in the world, you're not going to have 7.5 billion people who suddenly love each other. You're going to have people who are somewhat indifferent to the world. And so that's not ideal, right? That's not an ideal outcome. So in terms of what we can do, we can look to this idea, or how to help people thrive, how to move up their baseline of happiness permanently, how to get them to happy. And we can look to this research, which is really concerned with building strengths and reducing weaknesses, cultivating the best things in life and repairing the worst, making the lives of normal people fulfilling, and healing pathology. And so one caveat here is that this research is certainly useful, but it's not a replacement for therapy and for medication. You know, there are going to be, we all have different brain chemistry, and some of us might need therapy or might need medication, and others of us might not. So consider these as a good supplement to whatever it is you're currently doing. They're certainly not going to make you less happy, right? And the positive psychology interventions that have come out of this research, I've looked over every intervention that's in existence, anything that's ever been published that I could find. And the ones I talk about in my book and the ones I'll mention to you today, they all have significant empirical support. And so what I mean by that is they've been validated time and time again, usually hundreds of times. And we found that in these experiments, they do make you happier. So that's a good thing, is that these interventions can increase happiness and they can build resilience. So what this research tells us is something that I hope, or I think you probably already have an idea of, and that's that, to quote Ed Diener, it appears the way we perceive the world is much more important to happiness than objective circumstances. It's not so much the situation that you're in that's going to determine your happiness, it's how you respond to it. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, to the different minds, the same world is a hell and a heaven. So two people facing the same situation, one might be happy and the other might be miserable, purely how they perceive it. You know, and again, going back to that challenge versus threat, if you can see those stressful situations in your life more as challenges than threats, you're more likely to cope successfully and be happier. And William Shakespeare said, nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So we suffer often much more in our imaginations than we do in reality. We ruminate, we worry, we build up our anxiety because a lot of us don't have the tools that we need to shift our perspective, to make us a bit happier. So this is sort of what the research tells us, is that some people will be happy regardless of their circumstances in life. When I talked to you earlier about the happiest people, not all of them had their basic needs met. That is an incredibly important thing, but you see people all over the world who are suffering on a daily basis, but they're so grateful, they're so engaged, they're so present in their lives, that they're still able to be happy. They have good relationships. They have family and friends that they rely on. And you've got people who are billionaires who are miserable. So that's, those external circumstances, they matter, but only about 10%. They only predict about 10% of your happiness. So these interventions that I want to talk to you about, they can dramatically improve your happiness levels. And so these are treatment methods or intentional activities that aim to cultivate positive feelings, behaviors, or cognitions. Essentially, what they are meant to do is to help you mimic the thoughts and behaviors of people who are already very happy. And I want to walk you through some of these right now. So when we think about positive psychology interventions and the research that's been done on them, gratitude, I've got to tell you, from all my research, I've got to say gratitude is one of the most important things that we can do. A lot of you mentioned in the chat, and you're absolutely right. I think somebody mentioned spending time with their grandchildren. If we can be grateful for being here right now, for having running water, for having a roof over our heads, for having food, for having clothing, that's pretty incredible. It's so easy. I do this all the time. It's so easy to get caught up in our daily lives and to forget how many people don't have electricity, how many people don't have running water, how many people are suffering on a day-to-day basis. And if we can be grateful for a situation, we're much likelier to be happy. That's one of the biggest ways to improve your well-being. So there's a couple of things that you can do. Before I walk through the other experiments, I want to go. I want you to briefly just close your eyes, and nobody can see you. You're not on video or anything. So I want you to close your eyes for a minute, and I want you to remember someone who did something enormously important to positively change your life, who you never properly thanked. So I hope everyone has someone like that, someone who's really made a big positive impact on your life. And what you would typically do, we're not going to do it right now, but I'd urge you to do it after you're done, is you write a letter to this person and you tell them, you can open your eyes if they're still closed. You tell this person specifically what they did to improve your life, how it impacted you, how it's changed you for the better. And there are a couple things that you can do with the results. So, Angel, I see your message about posting the slides. I'll give them to Denny and we can get them posted. So there are a couple things that you can do with this, and I've tried it, and it really is incredible. So once you're done, you've thought about this person, you sit down, take about 10 minutes and write a letter to them. And when you're done with that letter, you're done describing exactly what they did for you, how it changed your life, how you're grateful for it. You can do a couple things. So you can call them up and read it to them. That's beneficial. You can do it face-to-face, which COVID times is tough. We found that's the most beneficial. People usually break down in tears, they start crying, because as you can imagine, this doesn't just increase your happiness levels. Imagine someone comes to you with a letter like this, that you had no idea how much you impacted them. And I promise you, all of you have impacted somebody in a significant way, in a positive way. And you might just not know how much you've done that. And so you can go and you can read it to them, and that's the best thing you can do. You can mail the letter to them, and that's still good. Or you can tear it up and throw it out. And we found that even tearing it up and throwing it out, you're still significantly happier for about 3 months after you've written this letter. That's pretty incredible. You don't even have to give the letter to this person. You'll get, you're going to get a much bigger benefit from giving it to them, but you don't have to. And so this is one act of gratitude that you can engage in. And you'll you'll notice that some of these interventions you can engage in on a daily basis. Some you'll want to engage in on a daily basis and make a habit. And some of them you'll probably only do a few times. The writing a letter of gratitude, I've only done that once, although there are a lot of other people that I could and probably should thank. So another thing to do is to every morning when you wake up, write down 3 things that you're grateful for. This is something that I've done for over a decade, and I can tell you I absolutely can tell the difference when I don't do it. Even when I just think about it in my mind, it's not as effective as the act of writing it down. So the interesting thing about this is you might be saying, well, this is pretty easy, right? 3 things I'm grateful for. I can think about that right now. But it has to be 3 new things every day. And once you get done with family, with friends, with, food, shelter, clothing, all that stuff, now it gets a little bit harder. And imagine, a few years into this and you're still trying to think of new things. This is training your brain to think more positively. And this is particularly important because in the morning when you're first up, you're not, you're probably not fully awake, and you're more susceptible to all the stuff that could potentially ruin your mood. For instance, one of the studies that Sean Acher did was he looked at people who watched the news in the morning. That was the first thing they did. And he found that they were 27% more likely to report being unhappy during the day if they woke up and just watched even 3 minutes of news. So if you're used to getting up and turning on the news, which is usually full of the worst, events and people, then I would recommend you wait a little bit. Wait till you have your coffee first, at least. So that's one thing you can do. At the end of the day, you can write down 3 good things that happened that day. And you can switch it occasionally and write down 3 of the funniest things that happened that day as well. That's also beneficial. But before you go to bed, write down or at least think about what are 3 good things that happened. And some days I think we all get to bed and we think, God, that was a hard day. But when we go back and we actually think about what happened, there's usually a lot of good stuff that happened. Maybe it was just a smile, or maybe it was that you were able to help somebody. So try those things and see how they work. What I'd recommend is trying them every day for at least a week. And if you like it, then continue on with it. That's one of the key things about these interventions. It's like exercise, right? If you make it too arduous, if you make it too difficult, you're not going to keep up with it. So you want to look at some of these things. And my book has a lot more and very specific directions on each one. But try to take what you can that you think you can incorporate into your daily life and go with those. So some other ones are practicing optimism. Here you are asked to think about your best future self. So where are you? Patricia's saying watching news at 3 a.m. makes me happy. You must be watching a different news station than I am. Practicing optimism. You're going to think about your best future and write about it. So just where do you see yourself, in the next few years? What is the best possible future that could look like? Acts of kindness. Again, I put in your calendar once a month, go do something kind for somebody else, something that they're not expecting. I promise you that this will make you lastingly happier. This is another one of the best ways to become happier is engaging in random acts of kindness. Using your signature strengths in new ways. So on the website Authentic Happiness, you'll find Martin Seligman created a test that's been completed by over 2 million people. And what they do is they identify your best strengths. And by using your strengths in new ways, we can be happier. And one of the ways this works is through this concept of flow. So when we're in a state of flow, time passes like this. You might have a hobby, whatever it is that you do, where the day, hours go by and you forget to eat. A big part of this is when we're using a high degree of skill in a highly challenging task, we can slip into this state of flow where the brain works automatically. We don't have to, we're not consciously aware of everything that's going on. We just seem to be, a lot of people describe it as being sort of caught in a current, in a wave. And my guess is, or my hope is that you've experienced this at one point or another, but knowing your strengths makes it easier to engage in a state of flow. So some other ones, mindfulness meditation. This is a big one. If you're not doing it already, I've got to tell you, when I first heard about meditation, I thought this is just some gimmick and it's not going to work. And then I actually read the research on it. And I think that in 10 years, this is going to be like jogging. Most people are going to know it's, or you know, walking, physical exercise. Most people are going to know it's good for you. Most people probably still aren't going to do it. But mindfulness and meditation, which is essentially one of the paths to mindfulness, is one of the most beneficial things you could do for yourself. So if you don't already, there's an app called Headspace, another one called Calm. They're free YouTube videos. I would absolutely recommend doing this. And so mindfulness just means being present and in a non-judgmental way. So you're not, you know, you're being present in whatever it is you're doing. You're not judging your thoughts. And for me, one of the best takeaways here is when my thoughts do go to negative things, I can say thinking and come back to whatever it is I'm doing. Because I find myself sort of, you know, drifting to these thoughts that aren't necessarily helpful in every instance. And it's a great way to make sure that you stay present. So exercise is, of course, beneficial. And then, so you're going to find if you get my book, you absolutely don't have to. You can find most of these for free online. If you go to the Greater Good Institute at Berkeley, you'll find the majority of positive psychology interventions that are in my book on there for free. So you can just buy it if you want to learn sort of the science behind each one. So these are some things that you can do to make yourself happier. But we want to know not just that they work, right? We want to know how it is that they work. And I'm going to check the chat here for a moment. Okay, so these positive psychology interventions, there's still questions about the potentiating mechanisms, specifically how they make us happier. But what we've gleaned from the research is that they lead people to reinterpret situations in a more positive way. If you were to ask me, you know, if you can only do two things to be happier, what would you do? Or what are the keys to happiness? I would say the most important one is your perspective, to change your perspective in a way that you're able to see more of the positives and less of the negatives, to see situations as challenges rather than threats. That's really, I mean, that's the key, is right, because the situation that you find yourself in doesn't matter nearly as much as how you respond to that situation. And the other, which I think impacts your perspective, is relationships. We've seen in the research that relationships are incredibly important. There's a study that's been going on at Harvard for nearly a century, and what they found is the people who lived the longest, they all had good relationships. So these happiness interventions, the good thing about them is that they're not only going to make you happier, so they're going to add more years to life, not just more life to years, not just years to life, but they are going to actually make you live longer. So that's sort of the good news. So these interventions, they help you to reinterpret your situations in a more positive way, to think and to act more positively. It's training your brain to think more positively. And they produce success through a positive feedback loop. So when you have a positive mood, this increases your tendency to set and reach goals, which increases positive mood. So you're more likely to accomplish those things that you want to accomplish if you're feeling better. And this is generally kind of how they work. So I've found that, with these interventions, what they do for me is they don't just bring more positive emotion. They certainly do that. But they change how I see the world. They change the lens through which I see the world. And just to give you some examples here, mindfulness not only helps us to be more present, but it also enables us to have more control over what we choose to attend to. It helps us to have more control over how thoughts affect us. The kindness intervention releases those feel-good chemicals like dopamine, while reminding us that there is good in the world. It's so easy sometimes to look around and think, gosh, you know, California is on fire. There's all this stuff going on. There's so much to be upset about. But in reality, life is probably pretty good for, you know, for the majority of us. It's better than most people had it a few centuries ago. So the intervention on forgiveness, which it wasn't listed in the slides, it's in the book, but it helps us let go of negative emotions that occupy the deepest crevices of our mind. You know, oftentimes, just like what I was talking about with mindfulness, we get caught up in negative feelings, negative emotions, and this forgiveness intervention is really useful for that. And then the meaning intervention sort of answers the question of why we're here. It gives us a sense of purpose. And my hope is that, you know, a lot of you have that already. But the meaning intervention, again, it's not in here, but it's in my book. That is, I think, a really useful one. So to sort of summarize all of this is, and I want to leave some room for questions. Happiness isn't easy, right? It's a pretty hard task for a lot of us. And I think that, as we've seen, the rewards are pretty great. It's going to take a lot of work to increase your baseline of happiness. It's not hard to make yourself happier today. Go get an ice cream, you know, go buy a TV. You're going to be happier for the rest of the day more. Well, if it's like me, you'll be happy until you're done with the ice cream. But if you want to be lastingly happier, it's not easy. You've got to implement these interventions into your daily life, just like you would with, you know, like exercise, reading. And so you're going to have, if you do this, you're going to have better relationships, you're going to have more energy, you'll live longer. As we've seen from the research on telomere, chronic stress kills us. 50 to 70% of disease and illness are related to chronic stress. And engaging in these is likely to reduce your stress. So I want to leave you with a quote by Viktor Frankl. If you haven't read his book, it's amazing. It's called A Man's Search for Meaning. And he said, he was a psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor. And he said, we who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. I think that you have a lot of choices that you can make in your life, and choosing to engage in these activities, choosing to help other people, choosing to help yourself. This is certainly not the easiest thing to do, but if you do this, you're going to change the way that you view your life, and just think about the benefit that can have not only for yourself, but for other people as well. So thank you so much, and I'm going to stick around for a while in case you have any questions.
John, we have one, which is, what quantifies a good relationship?
That's actually a really good question. So there is research on this, and we found that and I can just tell you the research from married couples. So in marriage, you generally need 5 positive events to occur for every 1 negative event for the relationship to be perceived as being, you know, good is a pretty ambiguous term, but to be a successful, happy relationship. So I would say probably a good relationship is, actually another really important piece of research is that you don't need that many. The research has shown you only need 1 or 2 close people in your lives. And I would define a good relationship really as having somebody you can go to, you can be authentic with, that you're not worried about being judged, that you can rely on in times of need. That is that person who's always there for you. We all need somebody like that. Even it doesn't have to be a spouse either. It can just be a friend. So that's kind of how I would generally describe those good relationships.
Oh, another one is, are there any studies related to happiness for retirees specifically?
So the only research I know about that has to do with age and happiness. And again, most of it points to people being happier as they age. However, and I'll add this to the slides when I pass it along to Denny. I'll put the studies in this last slide under in the notes. But there is one really important caveat to that: people generally get happier as they age. One aspect is that a lot of people tend to identify with their organization, with their job. And when they retire, they lose that sense of identity. And they also lose those connections they had at work. You know, you're not going into the office, you're not seeing those people, talking to them every day. So in that way, we see a pretty drastic, unless you have something else. You know, some people have grandkids that they are planning on spending their time with. Some people have hobbies. But if you don't have anything, then retirement is generally not the best thing. In fact, we found that people who retire early and don't have these other things to give them meaning and purpose, they tend to actually not live as long. So yeah, that would be the big thing, is that, you know, we need meaning. We need to live an engaged and purposeful life. If we don't have those things, then retirement can be really tough.
Another question is, how many relationships does one need?
Oh, good. Yeah. So you just one or two is what we've seen, and most of the research says actually having too many relationships, it's hard to have too many close relationships. At that point, we get to be, you know, maybe somebody's got 300 Facebook friends, but they don't know any of them. It's better actually in that case to have fewer friends that you're closer with. So you don't need many.
And my rules for social media is I don't friend anybody I don't know personally. You know, if I haven't met them or had a meaningful conversation or something, I don't friend strangers, because
yeah,
that's too much work in that environment, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
You talked about the genetics or possible inherited factors of happiness, and you said it was about 50%. Is there any predictability? I mean, can people say, you're going to have a grumpy baby? Or no?
It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, we've seen that this isn't the ideal situation, but oftentimes we do see mental disorders passed down through generations. We see addictive behavior passed down through generations. So yeah, I mean, if one person's a curmudgeon, there's a chance that their kids are more likely to be, but that doesn't mean that they have to be. That 10% certainly matters, and particularly with children. So these percentages are averages. These are, you know, for the average person, 50% is genetic, 10% external circumstances, 40% is cognitions, emotions, and all that. And this is for the average adult. But for children, the way that they're raised has a pretty big impact on their happiness levels. So for example, children who don't have parents that they can rely on, children who grow up around a lot of fighting, they're more likely to struggle with happiness as they get older. So maybe somebody is unhappy because they had a really tough upbringing and they raised their child in a completely different environment, and their child doesn't have those issues. So yeah, I mean, I think environment for children probably plays a much bigger role than it does for adults.
And this is, you know, the way I approach my happiness is it's a practice. It has to be purposeful. You know, I don't want to be a victim. I don't want to be this or that. So you're purposeful in what you're talking about in your approaches too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Another question is, how important is faith or some kind of faith system in relation to happiness?
So that's a really great question. It's one that's been explored a lot. And we've found that people who are religious, it doesn't matter which religion it is, they are generally happier than those who aren't. Now, the tricky part is there are a few reasons, I think, to this. One is there's less uncertainty and anxiety about sort of what happens next, right? Because your religion probably gives you some answers to that. And the other, probably equally or more important aspect, is the relationships that you get by going to church and things like that. So people who do attend, you know, weekly church service, they tend to have those relationships that others simply don't. And so for those reasons, we do see religion does tend to make people happier. And that's not, so when we look at religion, obviously extremism, that's a different story. We see people who are extreme and who are extremists tend to be less happy.
You you focus on the internal relationships in organizations as your specialty. I mean, I know happiness is a study of that, but I mean, do you also teach or coach or do anything related to that
Yeah.
To help organizations address that issue?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the big things I do with my work in consulting is essentially go into organizations, identify where their problem areas are through surveys and through other things, and we might find that maybe do a social network analysis study and find that people are being socially excluded, or find that job satisfaction or turnover intentions are really high in a certain area, or motivation or engagement is lower in a certain area. So we look at those things and then we implement different interventions based on what's happening. So yeah, that's another big part of it. And happiness is something I'm still trying to get CEOs to buy into this idea. They're much more interested in how to reduce turnover than how to make their employees happy. But it is something that, yeah, I do as well.
There's a correlation there.
Yeah.
Somebody asked the 3 quotes on happiness. Could you pull them back up on the screen?
Sure.
And because I just want to see those. And then I don't really know what this question means, but you can answer it however you wish. They said, are there ethnic correlations regarding happiness? You showed the countries, the happiness levels in the countries.
So it's a good question. I haven't seen significant differences by things like ethnicity, race, gender, by those demographic characteristics. A big part of it is that those characteristics don't account for much of your happiness. But certainly living in an economically developed society would matter. So for example, people in South Sudan are much less happy than any other country measured. So there's probably more of a correlational issue there, where maybe there are certain ethnicities where you would find that, but that's probably dictated by location.
Somebody asked for techniques on being happy around the unhappy people.
That's a tough one. So, and it's a really good question, because emotions are contagious. In fact, if 3 people walk into a room, the most emotionally expressive person tends to transmit their attitude to others within a few seconds. So we've all been in a room and you can feel anxiety and tension. The quick thing would be choose wisely who you spend your time with, who you give your time to. Try not to stay around people who are going to be really overly negative. But we don't always have a choice, right? Maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a coworker. And so for those situations, I think you just have to practice these different interventions, practice being mindful when this person's, going off on negative things and you're getting frustrated. And you're thinking negative thoughts, you can bring yourself back to the present. You can practice gratitude, try to find something about that person that you do like and focus on that thing. So it's not an easy thing. I mean, if the research does show that if somebody's really unhappy around you, they're likely to bring down your happiness levels. So choose wisely.
Do you see a relationship between how people view the world and their political views?
Yeah, given the climate that we're in right now, I don't want to go too much into politics, but there is a huge political divide. And I think that has caused quite a bit of division. And I think certainly if you are affiliated with a political group that tends to have negative thoughts towards certain groups more often than others, then that's going to be problematic for your happiness. And I'm not an expert on politics, so I'm not sure each group what their numbers would be, but yeah.
Question that came via email was, are women happier than men?
Ooh, good question. So the answer is, if they are, not by much. That there's not a big difference in demographics. women tend to need a little bit less money to be happy, but there's really minute differences. I mean, there's not enough to think that one or the other is true.
I think that's all the questions we had today. And I was telling him before we started this session today, how glad I am that he's focusing on this research and that you're here at Fresno State and doing it and helping our community and the students who are getting a different perspective than perhaps they would have gotten, you know, from a different professor. So it's great that you're here. And I just want to remind everybody, his book is The Happiest People. It's on Amazon. Did you say an online version was?
Yeah, so I made it so that the online version, I think at least for the next few days, is 99 cents if you want to buy that. And I think the other one's like $11. The hard copy is like $11.
Yeah.
But yeah, so and again, all these interventions are going to be, not all of them, but I'd say 75% of the interventions you can find on the Greater Good Institute at Berkeley. So I would really just buy the book if you kind of want to know the science behind, if you want to know how each one of the interventions work, not just that they do work.
That's great. Well, we're so glad you were with us today and you found time in your teaching schedule. And you're our first, for our program, you're our first Zoom keynote talk. So we're really happy to have you. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate all of you spending your time with me. This has been very fun, and it gave, my baby's been sleeping for the last hour, so I'm glad he didn't run in here.
It's the meter of your voice.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, thanks everybody, and thank you, Doctor. And we will, if you have any questions, I suppose if you have further follow-up questions, you can send them to Danny or I, and we'll forward them on to him. But in the meantime, we really appreciate everybody's time, and we'll see you at the next course and the next talk.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.